I'm going to talk about moral reasoning and adaptation. In effect, a public talk, how people talk about these issues and whether or not they use moral reasoning in those discussions, and then talk about the implications of that. I guess the research question is, or the hypothesis is, that people do revert to issues of morals when they talk about climate change. And you would think that those would be around issues of solidarity, collective responsibility, imposition of harm on others, and vulnerability. But not necessarily so. So let's just have a look and see what they do. And the prevalence of this different type of these different types of moral reasoning. What does it mean for public support for adaptation, and what does it mean for the governance of adaptation? Let me start on this. So social psychologists and lots of people in the risk communication business, in particularly looking at all types of pro-environmental behavior, very interested in this. Should we actually be appealing to promote pro-environmental behavior? Should we be appealing to instrumental values, like it's good for your wallet to be pro-environmental, it will save you money, it's a rational thing to do? Or should they be appealing to less instrumental and more moral terms? And again, this is an empirical question, but one in which most social psychologists will say that there is what you would call a moral gap, that without moral talk and without moral reasoning, that even if there are instrumental reasons to undertake pro-environmental behavior, many people don't do so. And those where moral reasoning and instrumental values are harmonious are the places where we do see more positive and progressive action and the rest of it. But there are many, what Robert Gifford refers to as dragons of inaction, all sorts of things that mean that people do not move towards pro-environmental behavior. So the idea in social psychology and moral foundations theory, of course, is that actually the way that actually these moral values actually underpin behavior. And so our framing of what is an instrumental benefit to us of undertaking pro-environmental behavior is in fact the root of this, the basis of this are a set of moral reasoning, but those moral reasons aren't monolithic. They aren't the same for every public policy and every issue of collective action. And so the question is then, how is climate change portrayed as a moral issue? If you look at the empirics of this, it does tend to be around issues of imposed harm, collective responsibility, precaution, and vulnerability, and the like. So is there a natural portrayal of climate change? And you would imagine they are. These would be, and I've called these vulnerability-based or care-based motivations around solidarity, victimhood, ability, need, entitlement, protection from harm, and the rest of it. But there are other moral values, what the psychologists call system-based, which tend not to be deployed in arguments around climate change. And they are things like respect for authority, the preservation of the status quo and social order, patriotism, sanctity, purity, naturalness, and those types of morals. So Feinberg and Willer, in this very well-known paper, look at this in the American context and say that, in fact, those vulnerability-based portrayals of climate change, harm, solidarity, and the rest of it are very, very prevalent. They look at the discourse, they look at a lot of public documents and the rest of it, and media portrayals, and find that those are there and dominant, and that this is a natural way to talk about climate change. But they also find that in the American context that those only appeal to liberals, and that conservatives are put off those because conservatives tend to be focused more on system-based moral values. And so when they undertook an experiment and they portrayed climate change around issues of sanctity, purity, naturalness, those actually then appealed much more to those of a conservative nature. So that's about pro-environmental behavior, but what about adaptation? So how do we talk about issues around adaptation, responsibility, and the rest of it? Most research on adaptation and on vulnerability is focused on those directly affected by, most social science research, should I say, those directly affected by the impacts of climate change, about their values at risk of those who are actually directly affected, sorts of things that John was talking about earlier, about their agency, the agency of people who are directly affected, and even about how the experience of having extreme weather, being vulnerable to climate change, even affects your ideas of citizenship or pro-environmental behavior, your willingness to engage in mitigation and the rest of it. There's actually much less on what the general public think about adaptation and how they talk about adaptation and the rest of it. I'm going to talk about that, but I'm going to talk about it in the cultural context of the UK. And I'd say it's important to remember that moral reasoning has a significant cultural dimension to it. It's not the same everywhere. This is not universal. There is no universal way to talk about climate change. And the other thing I need to say about the UK, of course, just to preface this, is that climate change is a less partisan political issue in the UK. There's a greater public acceptance that climate change is a serious issue. But yet the impacts of climate change within the UK, within the populace, are seen as being geographically marginal or very focused on specific populations or very focused on specific geographical locations vulnerable specifically to flooding. There also is in the UK a political and institutional context of the UK Climate Change Act 2008 that mandates the government to get the country ready for the impacts of climate change and to make sure that we are adapting. And in that context, the UK government produced lots of data. It commissioned Ipsos Mori, which is a professional polling organisation, to do quant and qual sampling of the UK population. So these are not people who are directly affected by climate change. This is a random sample or a randomised sample of the UK population. And there's lots from this survey, but it basically shows that in this detail, in this slide, what it shows is that people in the UK believe that in their lifetime they've seen a much, much greater instance of flooding, periods of heavy rainfall and coastal erosion, but they think that they haven't seen hot summers and heat waves. That's just how the public perceives the issues of risk, again, for context. But what I'm going to talk about is moral reasoning within it. And so Ipsos Mori conducted, for all our benefit, 14 deliberative workshops across the UK, ranging from Pitlochry in the north to Brighton in the south, and with 148 participants in the winter time, which may have affected this perception about flood risk and the rest of it. And what we have done is actually looked at the transcripts of these. The government commissioned this but never did anything with them, and we have now taken this data and begun to look at these issues of moral reasoning within them. And this is what people say about this. So the question is, do they address adaptation to climate change using moral reasoning? And secondly, are those vulnerability-based or system-based arguments? Now, these are non-representative quotations I'm putting up for illustration. This analysis is ongoing, but I think these make the point. The way I see it is when you pay your tax, and I should say these are this is all from transcripts from London, from a London focus group. The way I see it is when you pay your tax, but you trust in government, whether you trust them or not, it's trusting the government to allocate those funds for the general greater good. So, as Londoners then, would you rather spend the money on London, the Thames Barrier, flood protection for London, or for the greater common good? The greater good, so there will be agriculture for the whole country. I don't think people in local areas mind sticking together in rough times, like when the bombs went off. This is referring to July 2005. People did stick together in times of adversity. I think it's wrong when the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and making the poor pay more doesn't make sense. Solidarity isn't that easy. So what would you do about flood defence and the rest of it? Well, I would protect all people's houses, but the problem is they don't all live in one area. It's elderly people, it's children, it's that kind of thing, anyone who can't look after themselves. So the solidarity issue clearly comes out in unstructured public talk on these issues. But yet you also get, I think government should do something. I think that for, say, some risks, like heatwave risk, the majority of people can buy their own fans. You understand them. You need to take precaution. So appeal to individual action and the rest of it. And I love this. And everyone's going to hate me for saying this. As always, you get your pen out when people start to say these things. But not doing anything is an acceptable solution because of the moral hazard problem. People will need to take responsibility for where they live and why they live there and the risks that they face. So, what we have found is that when the general public talk about adaptation, we see both of these coming through the vulnerability-based moral talk. Well, first of all, the first finding is people do refer to climate change and the dilemmas around adaptation using moral reasoning. I think that's an important finding and shows there probably is not a moral gap whenever it comes to discussions on adaptation in the same way as there is around pro-environmental behavior like mitigation. But if that's true, what do they do? So we find both of these competing. And the implications of this are that people are more likely to give support and priority. Don't forget, this is the general populace, and because we have been faced with these dilemmas. The Prime Minister of Britain last winter said, we are going to tackle floods and money is no object. Imagine a Prime Minister saying that. Most of the professionals that I worked with have written that down or taken that quote and put it above their computer screens. Money is no object, yeah? So this is important in terms of public support. So vulnerability-based motivations are more likely to give support and priority for the protection of marginal places and marginal people, and also for collective public insurance, and this is quite important, whereas system-based moral reasoning may have greater resonance with those actually aimed at defence, maintenance of the status quo, prevention of these things, and actually hard engineering. So I think the policy solutions that emerge around adaptation, if they are to gain public support, need to resonate with the moral way that people, and the moral reasoning that people undertake whenever they are acquiescing, giving support, voting for, and engaging in adaptation. Thank you.